Okay, welcome back to Philosophy Roulette. This is going to be episode 36. We just did the colonized and the wrong of colonialism, which was kind of fun. So, moving right along, what should we do next? Paradox of unrestricted quantification. I don't want to do logic. I don't want to have to read out formulas. I mean, I like logic, but I don't want to read out formulas online. A dilemma for selection for action. What could that be? Hardcore actualism non-existence? I think I tried clicking on this once. Let's see what this is though. No file. No file, no read. So sad. Proving that the mind is not a machine? Question mark. Wow. Yay! Okay, Johannes Stern. So I think the second. No, I reviewed something by Johann once. This is the first Johannes. Alright, exciting. Oh, oopsie. Hello, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Didn't mean to click on that. Go away. Deary. Not gonna open. Oh. Sure, here we go. Oh dear, what did I just do? I'm sorry, people, I'm just maybe more confused than I realized. And here we are. Alright, let's get the... Oh. Alright, there you go on this one. And then let's just get this updated. And we'll be off in a jiffy. Alright, so. Proving that the mind is not a machine. Question mark, asterisk. This is a pre-peer reviewed version. Okay, so maybe there's typos. No, I'm not going to read the abstract. Let's just jump into this. It has seemed to a number of prominent philosophers and scientists that Gödel's incompleteness theorems prove that mechanism is false. That is, that minds cannot be explained as machines. Unfortunately, so far little evidence has been produced in support of the sentiment. Really? Okay. The proofs that purportedly show that the mind cannot be a machine have not been generally accepted. Rather, these so-called proofs have been widely found to be unsound and falling short of establishing that mechanism is false. In this piece, we propose a new such proof with scare quotes. If one adopts a particular form of mechanism and a specific solution to the semantic and intentional paradoxes, one can show that the mind is not a machine. Okay. So, we've got semantic and intentional paradoxes and a specific formulation of mechanism. Let's find out. The basic idea of these Gödelian arguments against mechanism is that Gödel's incompleteness theorems imply that no formal system, that is, no machine, can prove all mathematically true sentences. Well, I mean, yeah, alright, so they're going to imply Turing machine, and, alright, we have to keep going. The incompleteness theorems tell us that for each formal system that there will always be true sentences, for example, the Gödel sentence of the system, which the formal system cannot prove. Sure. However, by following the reasoning of the proof of Gödel's first incompleteness theorem that the human mind, so the argument goes, can establish for any given formal system that the Gödel sentence of the system is true. Right. So the argument goes, can establish for any given formal system that the Gödel sentence of the system is true. If this reasoning were correct, we could conclude that the theorems the human mind can prove cannot be produced by a machine. Yet, as has been pointed out by a number of authors, the Gödel sentence of a formal system is true only if the system is consistent. Yeah, matters about consistency here. So to establish the Gödel sense of a system is true, the human mind needs to be able to establish the consistency of this formal system. In order to complete the argument, the anti-mechanist thus has to argue that the human mind can establish or perceive the consistency of any sound formal system. But this is a very strong assumption, arguably too strong an assumption, even if we impose strong idealization conditions on the human mind, as is usually done. So one would expect proponents of the Gödelian arguments against mechanism to provide convincing arguments for this assumption. At least the first generation of Gödelian arguments by Lucas, Penrose, and Penrose failed to provide such independent arguments. Moreover, it was convincingly argued that without additional assumptions, there is very little hope for such Gödelian arguments against mechanism to succeed. In a very natural framework and a very formal framework, it is consistent to maintain the mechanism thesis. Alright, you've got double colons in this one sentence. You should probably avoid doing that. It cannot be refuted. Okay, well, it's a very short second colon. So, okay. Gödel, 1995. I mean, he was long dead by 95, but himself did not think that his incompleteness theorems imply that the mind is not a machine. Rather, he thought the incompleteness theorems imply that ... either the human mind, even within the realm of pure mathematics, infinitely surpasses the power of any finite machine, or else there exists absolutely unsolvable Diophantine problems. This disjunctive conclusion is also known as the Gödel disjunction, or as Gödel's disjunction. Gödel's disjunction is actually a conditional claim. It asserts that if the human mind is a machine, then there are sentences the human mind can neither prove nor refute. That is, there are absolutely undecidable sentences. If we accept Gödel's terminology, his disjunctive conclusion indeed follows from the incompleteness theorems. But, as Gödel argued, and we have also pointed out, this by no means establishes the first disjunct, namely that the human mind infinitely surpasses the power of any finite machine. Originating with Gödel's discussion, the term absolute provability was used in contrast to formal provability, or provability relative to a formal system. I mean, this is the only thing we really have access to, provability relative to a formal system. Everything else is, what else are we have to only work within formal systems. So this is a good point. Absolute provability is supposed to be an intuitive notion of provability that is meant to capture the process by which the human mind produces mathematical theorems. With this terminology in place, the question of whether the mind is a machine amounts to the question of whether the absolute provable sentences can be generated by an effective algorithm. From our previous discussion, it ought to be clear that without further assumptions about the absolute provability, there is very little hope of providing such refutation of mechanism. It should be like mechanismism, because mechanism is just a thing. A mechanism. It's mechanicismism. Yeah. Okay. Indeed, in his new argument, Penrose 94 and 96 introduced further such assumptions about absolute provability, in contrast to the older generation of arguments, which are for the most part simply question begging. Penrose's new argument fails to refute mechanism for subtle reasons. The prima facie plausible assumptions on behalf of absolute provability turn out to be jointly inconsistent. That is, they lead straight to intentional paradox. Okay, so a bunch of discussions on that apparently. According to Wang 96, Gödel thought if one could clear up the intentional paradoxes somehow, one would get a clear proof that mind is not a machine. Indeed, we... See, why did you put the reference here and here? This maybe should get... Just put the page 187 over there. That's a little odd. Okay. Indeed, we will show that if a specific solution to the intentional paradoxes is adopted, one can give a proof that the mind is not a machine, given a suitable formulation of this claim, albeit not along the lines of Penrose's original argument. The solution to the intentional paradoxes we have in mind connects the intentional to the semantic paradoxes and assumes the paradox of truth to be the source of all these paradoxes. As a consequence of this strategy, if a solution to the paradoxes of truth in the form of a consistent theory of truth is provided, the intentional paradoxes disappear alongside. Yeah, but you have to solve a lot of stuff in that case. I mean, if you solve all the problems and you know about mind and machines, it's like, well, okay, cool. As it turns out, if with modeling 04 the truth of KF, sometimes called FM, is chosen to be the appropriate solution to the paradoxes of truth, then we can prove that the mind is not a machine given a suitable formalization of this claim. Truth and intentional paradox. Work by Myhill and Montague has taught us that if we treat modal and intentional notions as predicates, paradox will arise. This holds in particular for the notion of absolute provability, the two constitutive principles of absolute provability formalized by a sentential predicate K. Alright, so we got T, K of phi implies phi, and this is like truth or something, or find out. And necessity, if phi is a theorem, then so is K of phi. For all senses, five language are jointly inconsistent. Our proposed resolution of the paradox is to explicitly introduce a truth predicate, the idea that T and neck implicitly assume a naive truth predicate, which in the presence of self-referential sentences leads to paradox, as Gödel and Tarski have taught us. As a consequence, the naive truth predicate has to be replaced by a non-naive truth predicate, for which phi and T of phi are no longer equivalent or intersubstitutable in all contexts. This means making the truth predicate explicit in formulating the principles of absolute provability. We are led to the following alternative principle of absolute provability, which at least prima facie seem to enjoy the same intuitive support as T and neck. Alright, so for all Tk, for all x, kx implies tx, and t necessity, if T of phi is a theorem, then so is K of phi. And I mean, you got these square brackets are for Gödel numbering, usually. Whether a paradox will arise now only depends on the theory of truth we adopt. If this theory is consistent, then the theory of truth and absolute provability will also be consistent. No intentional paradox will arise. Yeah. I mean, it's not trivial just to say, okay, we're going to call it consistent. So I wonder how they're going to show it's consistent. I mean, just because it doesn't look like it's going to get to paradox don't mean it won't. In 3 recent papers, Kollner uses the strategy for resolving intentional paradoxes to investigate arguments against mechanism. Kollner raises this general challenge for the anti-mechanist to provide a philosophically motivated theory of truth in which a convincing argument for the claim that the mind is not a machine can be carried out. Kollner remains skeptical in this regard and provides us with good reason for his skepticism. He shows that if Pfefferman's 08 attractive theory dt, determinate truth, is adopted, then no argument against mechanism can be successful. Mechanism is consistent with the theory dt, supplemented by a plausible principle for absolute provability that are formulated following the strategy outlined above. Indeed, Kollner shows that the mechanistic thesis is independent. It can be neither proved nor refuted. Okay. Inspired by Kollner's challenge, we investigate the consequences of adopting the theory of truth kf instead of the theory dt as a solution of the paradoxes of truth. Kf may be viewed as an axiomatization of Kripke's theory of truth in classical logic, and is perhaps the most popular theory among classical theories of truth. In particular, Maudlin has defended kf as the correct solution of the paradoxes of truth. The theory is in an important sense compositional. The truth predicate commutes with all logical connectives and quantifiers with the exception of negation. For the purpose of this paper, we will only rely on 2 aspects of kf. First, we need the truth predicate to distribute over a disjunction, so T, the Gödel numbering of phi or psi, implies T phi or T psi for all phi psi. Second, we need to use the fact that KF proves one direction of the T schema. T schema. Okay, so you get release, as it were. They're calling it T out over here. So T Gödel number of phi implies phi for all phi. Let's call the extending piano arithmetic by the principles disjunction D and T out together with TK, APT absolute provability and truth, and apt is a consistent theory, and they have a reference for that, I guess. Check these things. As we shall see, at least under a particular formalization of mechanism, apt proves that mind is not a machine. The argument. In the framework of the Lucas-Penrose arguments, mechanism is the thesis that mathematical theorems of the idealized human mind can be generated by some effective procedure. If we identify machine with Turing machine, this means, assuming Church's thesis, that the theorems of the idealized human mind can produce the output of a Turing machine. Availing ourselves to the notion of absolute provability, this means that the set of absolute provable sentences can be recursively enumerated. That is, there exists an explicit set of axioms and rules that proves all the absolutely provable sentences. Accordingly, to refute mechanism, probably should be capital here, one has to show that there exists no explicit system of axioms and rules that proves all the absolutely provable sentences. This would establish that the mind cannot be a machine, that is, anti-mechanism. Assuming that there was an explicit system of axioms and rules that proves all the absolutely provable sentences, we can say anything about what kind of system this would be. This depends on what the status we attribute to the underlying logical laws. If we ascribe to the logical principles a special status in contrast to the remaining axioms and rules, then we may assume that each such explicit system of axioms and rules proves all logical truth, independent of which axioms and rules we ultimately adopt. This means that if we take classical logic as our logic in question, then all classical logical truths will be provable in the system under consideration, no matter which system it is. Let's call this position orthodoxy about logic. The chance, it's just, everyone has tried to solve the paradoxes, and yours truly included, not solve, but has looked at these things. If you come up with a solution, there's always a trade-off here. So it's not like there's always a trade-off in this stuff. So it's a question about how much is really being proved here and what are you really trading off. Hopefully we'll get to some of this stuff in this paper. Still plenty of space to go. Orthodoxy about logic need not be accepted. It is perfectly conceivable that logic does not have a special status in comparison to the remaining theoretical postulates, and more to the point, that we may not assume at the outset that the logical truths of one particular logic will be provable in each of the formal systems considered. In this case, the only assumption we are allowed to make is that the theorems of the explicit system of axioms and rules are recursively enumerable, that is, they are the output of a Turing machine. This is a more general formulation of mechanism and is one Kollner adopts in his discussion. This would be some form of non-orthodoxy about logic. While orthodoxy about logic is by no means generally accepted, it underlies, or at least implicitly, a good number of philosophical discussions, and it is thus not unreasonable to see where it leads us in the context of the present debate, especially since a classical solution to the paradox has been adopted. Well, just been adopted above, not like it's a generally accepted thing. Consequently, in what is to come, we will take such an orthodox stance and will consider classic logic to be sacrosanct and not up for debate. Okay. Under these assumptions, mechanism is equivalent to the claim that the absolutely provable sentences can be proved in classical logic from a recursive set of sentences. Assuming this characterization of mechanism, we now move on to Turing mechanism and anti-mechanism, turning mechanism and anti-mechanism into precise formal claims. To this end, we use the predicate K for absolute provability again. If sigma is a recursive set of axioms of some theory T, we let little sigma be a natural representation of this set in the language extending the arithmetic language of, say, piano arithmetic. Let PR little sigma be a natural provability predicate of T. That'd be italic T or something. Given these stipulations, mechanism amounts to the following thesis: mech. There exists some sigma that for all x, the absolute provability x, if and only if PR sigma of x. So a refutation of mechanism would reject this claim. That is, anti-mechanism would be the thesis that there are no recursive sentences sigma from which all the absolutely provable sentences follow. Okay, so it's the exact same thing as mech with a negation put in front of it. Okay. Following the outlines of the traditional arguments by Lucas and Penrose, our refutation of mechanism will proceed via a reductive strategy. We will assume that the absolute provability, the absolutely provable sentences coincide with the theorems of some recursively axiomatizable set theory T, and will derive a contradiction starting from this assumption. That is, we will assume for all x absolutely provable x, if and only if provability sigma of x. Because what is the provability sigma of x? A natural provability predicate of T. I'm not entirely certain on what natural probability predicate of T is, but let's keep going. However, it is important to notice that throughout the reductive proof we may not assume that the human mind knows which recursively axiomatizable theory it is. This would not amount to a refutation mechanism, but of a much stronger claim. In particular, even though the reductive argument will be carried out in apt, and implicitly we may assume that in our reductio assumption of PR sigma stands for the provability predicate of apt, we may not infer provability sigma of the Gödel sense of a phi when we have proved phi. Okay, so we may not infer that it's provable even when we have proved it. Alright, so here's what you're giving up. You may be able to prove something, but you can't say it. So, or you may not infer it. Alright, so something's going on right there. I'm not entirely certain what the, you can't appeal to Loeb's derivability conditions. So yeah, there's something going on right here that is over my head. Why can't you appeal to Loeb's derivability conditions? I'm not entirely sure. Need a better logician than me. Before we give the argument, we introduce the standard liar sentence as a sentence lambda such that apt or any other arithmetical theory extending Q in an arithmetic language contains the truth predicate proves not T lambda if and only if lambda. We can now give the argument to the effect that the mind is not a machine. We reason in apt. Assume for reductive that the mind is a machine. So this is the proof by contradiction, and this is the premise. For all x, we get absolute provability such if and only if provability sigma in the for that language of x by the principle TK of the reductio. All right, we're gonna get implies. Okay, so the k turns into a t for tk because that's what we were doing earlier, and by universal instantiation for any y, provability y sigma implies t. I mean, just taking the right to left direction of this, k turns into a t, and by universal instantiation you get yourself provability sigma lambda or not lambda implies provability of the truth of lambda or not lambda. Since lambda or not lambda is a classical tautology, it is provable independently of which axioms are assumed. Therefore, lambda or not lambda is provable relative to any set of axioms, and in particular is provable relative to the set of axioms at stake. So you just get is provable sigma or sigma that this yields. So then you can drop out. You get this for free. This the first part of the implication there. And then you get the truth of T or not, the truth of the Gödel sentence that is lambda or not lambda. Due to the disjunctive D truth predicate, then the predicate commutes with disjunction and have, you can pull this out. T distributes over, so truth of lambda or the truth of not lambda. Because of L, the left disjunct is equivalent to not lambda, but due to T out, the right disjunct also implies not lambda. We can infer not lambda because you can swap these and then you've just got T of not lambda, so you can infer not lambda. By L, the latter implies truth of lambda, and thus by T out we derive lambda. Yay! So you've got not lambda and lambda. This ends the reductive proof since it contradicts 6. We conclude not the assumption. Moreover, we have not introduced any assumption concerning a little sigma, and therefore we can introduce the universal quantifier. For all little sigmas, not the case that absolute provability, if and only if provability in the object language of apt. In the language of apt. The latter is clearly equivalent to anti-mech, the mind is not a machine. So anytime you have absolute provability, if and only a provability in a formal language, then you can't do that for any little sigma, which is any languages of some language L. Okay, this argument exploits the fact that in KF-style theories of truth and absolute provability, the so-called internal logic, the logic within the scope of the truth predicate, and the external logic diverge. Yeah, so you've got an internal theory and external theory, and this is very important to keep clear. The external logic is just classical logic, while the internal logic of KF-style is strong, clean. So that's not so classical. As a consequence, classical tautologies are generally true in the object linguistic sense and cannot be for sake of consistency. However, we have assumed classical logic throughout, and in particular a reductio assumption that is, this thingy reflects this fact since the axiom of classical logic are built into the standard provability predicate. This implies that we are only considering theories formulated in classical logic, and thus no matter which T we consider, T will prove the classical tautologies. As a consequence, TK has the effect of adding the classical tautologies to the internal logic of the theory. But as our argument shows, this leads to contradiction in KF-style theories of truth and absolute provability, and we may conclude that no recursively axiomatizable theory T can produce the same theories as the human mind. The mind cannot be mechanized. Okay, let's keep going for a sec. However, in apt, we cannot show that mech is false. Yes, here's where we're getting to it. That is, we cannot show that it is true that the mind is not a machine. Yeah, so this is, in the terminology of Kripke, mech is an ungrounded sense, and as a consequence, neither mech nor anti-mech can be proved true in apt, or more generally KF-style theories of truth and absolute provability. The best we can say is that mech is not true, but this does not imply that it is false, since the latter would imply the truth of anti-mech. This is just one example of the general phenomenon of KF-style theories. Provability and truth provably come apart. In such theories, provability outstrips truth. Yeah, because you are going non-classical here. I mean, even though they're saying they're classical, once you get to here, this KF-style thing, that's not classical. It's strong, clean. That's why it's a K. It's clean Pfefferman. Like, I think that's right. I hope I'm not putting my foot in my mouth. But, like, it's not a classical theory. That's what you're doing. You're going non-classical in this, like, instance here to, like, you're just trying to get around you're trying to limit where you're getting yourself a paradox. They're trying to force the paradox on the mechanist style thing, which is fine because it does occur. But then they're trying to protect themselves by saying, well, we're doing classical logic on the outside. But what happens is then you lose expressibility, as they're saying. You can't actually say what you've done because then you would be talking in the non-classical logic. So, this is another one of those double speak issues. The moral. Let's assume for the moment that orthodoxy about logic is correct. Alright, yeah, see, this is what they're going to try and get back to the classical sort of way of thinking. Then the strength of the argument clearly depends on whether we take KF-style theories of truth being an acceptable solution to the paradox of truth. Yes. In the previous section, we have seen several features of these theories that suggest that this might not be without problems. The main problem is, perhaps according to their own standard, KF-style theories are not to be trusted. There are senses that the theory proves, in fact, that all classical recursively axiomatizable theories of the language prove, and which are provably not true. However, despite these problems, there have been advocates of KF in the literature. Yeah, because this is not classical. So, most notably, Maudlin, 2004, is a heroic philosophical defender of KF qua theory of truth and solution to paradox of truth. Maudlin supplements KF with particular norms for assertion and denial that are designed to account for the clash between provability and truth in KF. Unsurprisingly, according to these norms, assertability outstrips truth. Asserting a sense does not generally commit one to the truth of the sentence. So, I mean, you can assert a sentence, but it doesn't make it true. And why you're asserting it, but okay. I mean, you're going to have to bite the bullet somewhere on all of this stuff. There's no non-biting the bullet. It is permissible to assert some sentences that are neither true nor false, namely a consequence of the semantic theory, that is KF. For these permissible sentences, it is not only permissible to assert them, but we can even believe and defend these sentences as long as we don't believe them to be true. So again, now you've got double belief. You can't even double speak them. You can assert them, but you can't assert the truth of them. But you can't assert them, but you can say them. You can defend them, but you can't believe them. But you can still you can believe them, but you can't believe them to be true. So this is what happens when you try to solve the semantic paradoxes. You get yourself into a lot of trouble with what can be asserted and can be and what you can say is true and not true. However, the other sentences that are neither true nor false are impermissible in that sense. For example, it would be impermissible according to Maudelin's norms for assertion and denial to assert the negation of a theorem of the theory. This is important because it shows that even though it is possible to assert sentences that are not true, in this is not tantamount to a trivializing the norms for assertion denial. Okay, so it's fair. You want to be able to still defend yourself and say, well, I'm asserting reasonable things, but it's a little ad hoc. You're trying to save your butt at this point because the theory itself underlying prevents you from being what would normally be conversationally appropriate in these cases. Alright, let's assume Maudelin is right and accept, is it Kripke Pfefferman or is it Clean Pfefferman? I forget. I'm losing it. I'm sorry. As a solution to the paradox of truth, probably Kripke. Sorry, Saul. Saul doesn't care. What does our argument then show? It shows that mech is impermissible and not true. Under no circumstances can we assert mechanism or believe it. In contrast, it is permissible to deny mech and equivalent to assert anti-mechanism. We are even licensed to believe this claim. However, we may not assert or believe that anti-mech is true. Yes, because again, the truth is dangerous in this case. Even though KF does not license this final step in the refutation of mechanism, our argument provides a sound argument for anti-mechanism if orthodoxy about logic is assumed. Yes, from this position you can assert it, but it's a question why are you asserting it then, but you can assert it and sound reasonable, but then if they say, is it true, you have to just keep your mouth shut. You just be like, why are you asking that question? Like, I don't want to talk about it anymore. It's like, okay. In this sense, it supports philosophers and scientists in their belief that Gödel's incompleteness theorem show, in a very indirect way, that minds cannot be explained as machines as long as they do not equivocate it to the belief that mechanism is false. Minds cannot be explained as machines as long as they do not equivocate it to the belief that mechanism is false. So it shows it, but it's not false. But what will the mechanist make of the argument and its starting? But what will the mechanist make of the argument and starting conclusion? Yeah. So this is nice. What has happened here is that you can get yourself a logic that gets you out of the paradoxes. And what this person has done in a clever way has associated the mechanistic way of talking with a that can prove anything, with a logic that can prove anything, but you can then show that doing that causes, well, you get paradox if you can use this person has shown that if you start from a position where you have a consistent theory and you add in these extra conditions about truth, you get yourself a paradox, which the semantic paradoxes have been known for a long time. And so if you do that, you will get yourself a problem. Now, what this person does has used the internal theory where you're using one logic and an external theory where you're talking about it, using slightly different theories. So in a classical setting, you're talking about a theory that you get out of the paradox by having two different sort of logics going on, the KF and classical. But then what happens is you can't talk about what you've done with the other logic because the two logics don't mix. So if you're using two different logics, then you can sort of assert things in one logic, but then you can't talk about it in the other logic, which you want to do because you want to have a sort of consistent way of talking. But you can't do that anymore if you are using two logics, basically one to be for the one way of thinking and one way of talking about what's going on. But that's one way of solving the semantic paradoxes. And of course, as they sort of end up, I mean, why would the mechanist make of the argument and startling conclusion? You gotta wonder, like, if someone, they could just, like, reject the setup, of course. And then there's stuff to reject in all of these setups. I should be better at this stuff. I should know this, but it slips from my mind. I have looked at it before. There's not the times when I can say I didn't look at this stuff. I have looked at this. Yeah, I'm just logic slides from me. Yep, so this is a nice paper. Basically, it's using the setup of the semantic paradoxes and solutions to them to find an application with theories of mind about machine. So that's cool. Good paper. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I guess that's it for tonight. I'll be back tomorrow. We're quarantined here in New York. Nothing else to do but read philosophy and, I don't know, drink a beer. So have a good night. Stay safe, everybody. If you have something you want me to review, let me know. Thanks. Bye.